Notice how attention collects. The focus is mutual. We all share in the collecting of attention. If we were to look at an object, we would tend to see that object in different ways. But allowing for our attention to collect, it tends to become very similar. This is because the inner presence has the qualities of a space. Of an articulate space. Called in music an interval. And just as in musical interval, the articulate space of collected attention has a structural cycle of occurrence. And it takes a long acquaintance to be able to transcend that. The classic way of transcending it to choose an example from ancient India. The historical Buddha taught that if you allow collected attention to arise, it will share its articulate space with whatever spatiality in a given form is occurring. So that in the middle length sayings, in the Majjhima Nikaya, the Buddha taught that meditation can be amplified by enlarging your collected attention from your body to the hut or the room in which you currently sit. For sitting was the usual posture for the body. That the next ring of amplified collected attention in this cycle of amplification was the entire domicile, the entire house of which this room was a part. And the level beyond that was the whole village. And the level beyond that, for in his time, most villages were surrounded by a forest, was the forest itself. So the body, to the room, to the house, to the village, to the forest, there we have our classic 5-phase energy cycle. And in classic Buddhism, in the historical Buddha's time, one description given to somebody who was very proficient at meditation was someone who was forest gone. Somebody whose collected attention filled the whole forest. The term in Sanskrit is aranyaka. And the first of all the Upanishads is called the Brihad Aranyaka, the great breath teaching in the forest. So that a language that would be spoken by someone who had amplified themselves to the level of filling the whole forest with a collective attention would speak with the resonant amplification on a scale which transcends, at least by a power of 4, the ordinary, confused smallness of the inarticulate, mediocre, worldly people. And that the inarticulate, worldly people would think that somebody who could fill their whole body with calmness, with intervaled articulate space, would be some kind of yogic master. And they would tend to look up to defer, to worship, to follow, to listen to somebody who could do that. And yet someone who could do that would be like on third grade level of what is really possible in spiritual development. And to someone who is forest bound, the person who can calm themselves and fill their whole personal space is still very young indeed. And someone like that would be quite surprised at someone who could fill the whole cosmos, like the historical Buddha. Not just the forest on one planet, but 3 trillion world systems at once. And so, in Asian wisdom, there is always this sense of humility, that when you begin to rise, when you begin to have facility, and you begin to calm yourself, and that calmed self begins to affect your life, don't be puffed up. And don't be hesitant, because one can go very far along this way. Lao Tzu is like the historical Buddha. He is in fact someone who is forest born. And his language comes with the amperage of someone who is on that level. Those who have just recently attained to calming their bodies cannot hear such a person completely. And so the translations of the Tao Te Ching are deficient by many orders of amplification. They are not just incorrect. They are not just flawed. But they are exponentially insufficient. Even the best of them are quite paltry, actually. And it's no wonder that in our time, even the Chinese themselves do not understand Lao Tzu, do not have an appreciation for the central synthesizing core of their civilization. 2 of the translations that I've brought tonight are very good in terms of this world and completely insufficient in terms of Lao Tzu. This one, Tao, A New Way of Thinking, Chang Chung Yuan, subentitled The Living Experience of Belonging Together. with a cover by Ching, very famous 20th century Chinese painter, is a Chinese presentation in English using a German philosopher, Martin Heidegger, as an inspiration. And so it has a very sophisticated European phenomenological interpretive base, a hermeneutical thesis based upon the kind of language mysticism of mid-20th century German phenomenology. And I'm going to give you his translation of chapter 50 in just a moment. Then compared to that is the latest English translation published by Bantam Books. And this translation by Victor Mayer, who is a very good academic, who has a lot of experience academically with East Asian material, who has done some very fine translating, for instance, of the Chinese esoteric stories dug up at the cemetery of Dunhuang, buried 1,000 years ago on the edge of the Gobi Desert. Victor Mayer is a very good scholar indeed. And his translation of the Tao Te Ching is selling probably many tens of thousands of copies, and just came out, and is based on the Ma Long Tui. Both of these men, in terms of this culture, in terms of this society, are very learned. Both are totally insufficient on many powers of amplification. For their translation does not speak Lao Tzu, but speaks in a kind of small pretzel, self-filling space, which to the next order of amplification of the room seems egotistical, and to the next level of amplification, the house seems very prosaic, and from the village amplification seems provincial without mercy. To someone forced going, it simply closed the door. Quote times. But we need to use these levels of attainment because we're coming out of a personal experience where already this seems above our head. And so we want to at least bring our eyes level to the level of these translations, and then try to let lots of forced-on language resonate through. And you will emotionally be able to tell that there is some quality, some intuitive quality, qualitative difference. And I would just suggest to you that you might let the sense of the difference from my translation and theirs just circulate in you this evening. All right? Here's the first translation. And this is a Chinese translation. And it came out in 1975. And chapter 50 of the Tao Te Ching reads this way, in this fairly competent in terms of world standards Chinese translation. To live or to die. 3 out of 10 men live, while 3 out of 10 men die. Further, 3 out of 10 men cling to life, but they lose it. Why? Because they all crave life. He who knows how to safeguard his life does not encounter tigers or rhinoceros. In the battlefield, he does not avoid dangerous weapons. Rhinoceroses cannot gore him. Tigers cannot claw him. Dangerous weapons cannot harm him. Why? Because there is no place in him for death. Compare that to this very capable, on an academic level, translation of the Tao Te Ching. A person comes forth to life and enters into death. 3 out of 10 are partners of life, 3 out of 10 are partners of death. And the people whose every movement leads them to the land of death, because they cling to life, are also 3 out of 10. Now, what is the reason for this? It is because they cling to life. Indeed, I have heard that one who is good at preserving life does not avoid tigers and rhinoceroses when he walks in the hills, nor does he put on armor and take up weapons when he enters a battle. The rhinoceros has no place to jab its horn. The tiger has no place to fasten its claws. Weapons have no place to admit their blades. Now, what is the reason for this? Because on him there are no mortal spots. So here are 2 translations that, in terms of this world, are published, are looked up to, are supposedly capable. There is no Lao Tzu in those translations. At best, there is some kind of homiletic warmth, but there is no charismatic lightning fire. There is a quality here of comfortable, proverbial, aphoristic advice, but there is no mind-penetrating language that sizzles into vanishing. Somebody once remarked about a translation of Pindar's Greek into English that the translator tried to take an eagle on a short walk on a shorter leash, and that's no way to appreciate the eagle. And just seeing him hop around over a few twigs doesn't give you any idea of when he flaps his wings and shoots into the sky. Here's chapter 50 in the translation that I've brought to you. Rising is life, returning is death. Life itself, of pursuers, in 10 you have 3. Death itself, of pursuers, in 10 you have 3. Gen itself, life, exchange itself, death's place. Also in 10 you have 3. Now what rationale? Because they live life itself's intensity. Indeed, Proverbs' ample shape of life, one on land travels, not meeting rhinoceroses, tigers, among soldiers, not shunning swords, spears. The rhinoceros's nothing place to insert its horn. The tiger's nothing place to place its claw. Soldier's nothing place to enter their blades. Now what rationale? Because it's nothing's death place. Now that follows the Chinese of the Lao Tzu very closely. This is the way Lao Tzu speaks. And we have to stretch our articulate inner space, several amplitudes beyond simply being tranquil, in order to get a breath deep enough to talk that way and mean it. That there is a kind of a language which is like the breath of the mountains, and one has to inhale a whole theatrical mountainous landscape in order to say Om once right. And in this way, Lao Tzu, in the Tao Te Ching, makes his language dance in a very special, particular way. He does a kind of movement with language which puts a word or a phrase in motion and then takes away all context to let you see that that word and that phrase have a context much wider than the one that you were just looking at. And that by taking away the expected context, you realize and discover an unexpected context, something more amplified. And then he takes away that amplified context and shows you that you have the capacity to be a personal space which fills a whole forest, not just your body. Here's how chapter 51 speaks in Lao Tzu's forest-gone language. Chapter 50 has the title Esteem Life. Chapter 51 has the title Nursing Te. Tao, living itself as Te, nurses itself, real form itself. Energy completes itself. Therefore, of the 10,000 things, one not honors Tao but esteems Te. Tao itself honors Te itself. In esteem, however, the one as itself commands, but always as self-selfness. Thus Tao, living itself, Te nurses itself, raises itself, nurtures itself, completes itself, matures itself, rears itself, protects itself, living but not to possess, making but not to claim, raising but not to rule. This is called profound Te. And you get a whole different sense of the kind of language that Lao Tzu speaks. 52 is called Return to Origin. And this is the way Lao Tzu speaks. Heavenly realm takes constellation, thereby pretends heavenly realm's mother. Let's pause there for a second. It's a kind of fearsome way to speak. Heavenly realm takes constellation. It's like a phrase. It means that when you look up at the heavens, which presupposes the night because there's more to the heavens, the stars are out. The first primordial gestalt that's made is to see constellations of the stars. As long as you're just seeing stars, you don't see anything. I mean, you pick out a star now and then, but you really don't see anything. But once you begin to see the night sky in terms of the constellations, it's only then that man learned to see that a few stars, a handful of stars, 5 stars, change their constellations after a while. After cycles of the moon, the star, one of these five will move out of a constellation into another constellation. And this was the way that planets were first discovered. Planet means a wanderer. It was the beginnings of the realization that there is a tremendous order, much, much beyond even the forest amplitudes. And so many tens of thousands of years ago, it occurred to those first men and women who had expanded their consciousness to fill a whole forest, that there was another level possible to fill the constellated night sky. Lao Tzu said that when the heavenly realm takes constellations, when that level of gestalt making has been achieved by someone, then the heavenly realm, in a kind of a let's pretend way, becomes the mother of new perspectives called conscious cultures. In a simple way of saying, as soon as there was an astrology, there was an astrologically influenced culture. So that the heavenly realm, when it's constellated, becomes a mother of new cultures, of new civilization. And so Lao Tzu's language begins in chapter 52 by saying this very succinctly, very dramatically, and by a kind of a balance which is characteristic of Homer, characteristic of Lao Tzu, characteristic of all the really penetrating great writers. All the great forest god conscious writers have this quality that when they wish to present something extremely important, they will frame an articulate space for it with language and balance it out, just like making a bracket or making a frame of reference. And by doing this, they use repetition or parallelism. They'll use the same word twice, or the same couple of words twice, or they'll use one sentence and then a second sentence, and so you get the couplet. Here in Lao Tzu, the words, the characters that are used twice, are the ones for heavenly realm. If we come to the Chinese text in the back here, and we look at chapter 52, and we bring out the first two characters. The first one is Tian, meaning heaven. And Tian is sort of like the shape that you would have of a man. The two legs, the arms outstretched, and then the neck. So you would have a Chinese character that was one long stroke, a little bit shorter stroke, and then a cross stroke. That would be man. But if you put a third stroke on top of the head, extending out, parallel with the arms, that's the character for heaven. It means that when man extends himself as far as his body will go, and out of the Saharastra chakra is able to add to himself in another horizon, that's what heaven is. Heaven to itself is not cognizable, but heaven, as we use language meaning heaven, we mean not just that thing, but we mean this amplitude. We mean heaven is an ultimate amplification of man's consciousness, of his spiritual elan. So that the first character at the beginning of this is Tian, and later on he will repeat that same character, Tian. So if we count from the first Tian, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 characters. between the Tians there are 5 characters. Notice how the 5 constantly reoccurs. The Chinese music is a pentatonic scale, the 5-phase energy cycle, the 5 elements. Notice how the comprehensibility of 4 fingers and a thumb, the thumb is being the Tao, of just the way in which articulation can happen. But if one is slovenly about it, it turns to grasping instead of articulation. The difference between grasping and articulation is the pacing of oneself by bringing one's spirit into the physical. If we are just physical, we grasp, like a bad little child, give me. But if we are mature, we can reach and we can exactly pick up, exactly give, exactly share. The Tao Te Ching never negates the activity of life. One of the chapters we had was esteem life. What it does, however, is caution us against this kind of unconscious, slovenly, false living, grasping. And so this phrase, the first character is Tian, the second is Xia. Tian Xia, heavenly realm. When sometimes translations are made, they call it the world. But I'm using a Lao Tzu type language, and he means to say Tian Xia. He means to say the heavenly realm takes constellation, thereby pretends heavenly realm's mother, when knowing as mother, in turn it knows its son. Now we'll talk about later, when we get to the Tao, the things that cannot be named at all. That's the Tao. Of things that can be named, this is the origin of all the things there are in the world. So Lao Tzu is saying here, in Return to Origin, that there has been a descent of Gestalt-making perspective, which was initiated by recognizing a shape of constellations in the starry heavens, in the starry expanse. And that from that recognition came a new mother of many civilizations, many ways. And that these civilizations gave a motherly context, gave birth to the people who lived in them. They are the sons. And that they learned, like sons, to care for their mother, to care for this tradition, care for this culture. And this was a way, Lao Tzu says, of sealing life so that life was possible. For if one lives on a more amplified level, one must commit oneself totally to living in the whole ecology of meaning on that higher level. Because if you take something from a previous level to the new one, it will break the new structure. You can't put new wine in old wineskin. So Lao Tzu is saying here, in his language, heavenly realm takes constellation, thereby pretends heavenly realm's mother, when knowing as mother, in turn, it knows its son, when knowing its son, in turn, keeps his mother, the purpose of living, not in danger. So that there is a seal by a process, by an ecology of meaning that flows in this kind of return back. It's like you have this cascade from heaven in the Gestalt constellation, making the culture as a mother making it possible for people to live on this higher level within the civilization or the culture under the aegis of this deeper symbolic structure of a constellated heaven. And when they, in turn, take care of the culture, which then corresponds and responds back to the heavens, there's this seamless ecology of the real, and people are at home. Life is not in danger. Thus, he goes on in chapter 52, keeping his mouth, shuts his gates. To the end, life is not troubled. But then on the other hand, opening his mouth, loses his affairs. To the end, life is not saved. In other words, the inarticulate speaking, the just blabbing, the just jabbering, the compulsive confessing, the frittering away with too much small talk, the conning of oneself and others, the misuse of expression as coercion, as baiting, as threatening, as alluring. All of these ways, one loses the inner seal, the participation in the inner seal of this large ecology of meaning. And Lao Tzu then ends this chapter with this non-assertive and yet very amplified discovery in language. To see the small is called bright. To retain tenderness is called strength. Employing its light mirrors home its brightness. Nothing surrenders his spirit to chaos. This is called practicing the eternal. There's a very famous phrase in Lao Tzu, practicing the eternal. The phrase here in Chinese, Shi Chang, Shi Chang, Shi Wei Shi Chang. This is called practicing the eternal. Now there's a quality here in Lao Tzu's language, which I'm trying to bring through in this translation, where he uses words that have a very close resonance, a deep correspondence. The Chinese characters are always monosyllabic. Each character has only one sound. So that typically, when Lao Tzu is speaking his classical archaic Chinese, if one were to say it out loud, there would be single syllables that occasionally group themselves in resonant pairs, like the Chinese for self-soness, zhi-jian, zhi-jian. Or when one comes here to the beginning, to gain insight, gain insight, the phrase is Ching. And chapter 53 begins with this title, Gaining Insight. Here's my translation for you. If I in great measurelessness have knowledge, I walk in great Tao. Only assertion is what I fear. Great Tao is very plain, but the people like byways. The palace is very splendid, fields very weedy, granaries very empty. to wear ornamental colors, to carry sharp swords, drastic drinking, eating, wealth, treasure, yet yearn. This is called robber's pride, anti-Tao, in fact. Now let's listen to the translation of 53 and compare it. This is Weir's translation. If I were possessed of the slightest knowledge, traveling on the Great Way, my only fear would be to go astray. The Great Way is quite lovely, but the people are much enamored of mountain trails. The court is thoroughly deserted, the fields are choked with weeds, the granaries are altogether empty. Still there are some who wear clothes with fancy designs and brilliant colors, sharp swords hanging at their sides, are sated with food, overflowing with possessions and wealth. This is called the brazenness of a bandit. The brazenness of a bandit is surely not the way. Let's see how Chang Chunyang has 53. If I had even a slight awareness and practiced the Great Way, what I would fear would be deviating from it. The Great Way is a very level road, but men like to take circuitous paths. Thus the palaces are extremely elegant, but the people's farms are extremely desolate, and there is no grain reserved in the storehouses. The rulers wear expensive garments, carry fine swords, satiate themselves with food and drink, and possess inordinate riches and precious things. This is the greatest robbery, and is indeed against the Great Way. Translation. Gaining insight. If I, in great measurelessness, have knowledge, I walk in the great Tao. This line, this cascade of Chinese characters which come down, the English line goes from left to right, the Chinese characters go from top to bottom, and they cascade down like a waterfall. And so you see a character, and then below that another character, below that another character, and all of these monosyllabic droplets of meaning, of language, of discursiveness fall, and these strings. You see here, in the Chinese, that if I am walking, if I am moving in my life, in an amplitude which is measureless, and the only measureless amplitude is Tao. If it were a measurable amplitude, it would be some correspondence of Te. But because it's measurelessness, it's like walking in the infinite. If I can be such a human being that I can step along in an infinity, I am indeed then capable of a relationality to the utterly open. And so his Chinese literally say this: if I in great measurelessness have knowledge, I walk in great Tao. Only assertion is what I fear. Why would one fear assertion? Because assertion would try to grasp something out of this context of the whole. Try to emphasize it beyond everything else. And the measurelessness would spontaneously collapse into a very fragile, small, personal situation. Personal in a derisive sense. And egotistical. Great Tao is very plain, but the people like byways. They get bored or tired because they don't sense that there's anything there. There's no sizzle there's no steam, because the Tao is seamless. Its sizzle is a comprehensiveness. Its steam is a thusness. And for someone who is looking for kicks, infinity doesn't hold much promise for thrills, because there's no up and down. There's no better than the other guy. There's no faster. There's no higher. There's no higher pay. And so the great Tao is very plain, but the people like byways. And then 3 phrases. The palace is very splendid, the fields very weedy, granaries very empty. Let's take a break. The earliest, perhaps we can get this on the tape, the earliest commentary on Lao Tzu is actually another classic, generally referred to by its author, Chuang-Tzu. And Chuang-Tzu lived about the 350s BC. And Chuang-Tzu, in his own delightful, mystical way, develops Lao Tzu, develops the Tao Te Ching by carrying the energy cycle back from down all the way through an amplified quality of the Tao Te Ching. So that if you were to, say, after this particular series of presentations, you were acquainted with the Tao Te Ching, by July, it should be very familiar to you. You should be able to have a sense of the taste and the style and the quality, the tang of Lao Tzu, so that you could recognize when something was like what he would be like. Chuang-Tzu would then be something that you could go to further develop your sense of this mystical appreciation for life. But whereas Lao Tzu has this firm, penetrating discovery of the clear scintillation of lightning, Chuang-Tzu has this paradoxical, mystical sense of wondering in his dream whether he was a butterfly dreaming he was a man, or a man dreaming he was a butterfly. So that a couple of hundred years after Lao Tzu, the cream of consciousness in China went to Chuang-Tzu and went to this enormously playful mystic paradoxicality. That particular generation, the generation of around 350 BC, was very special. Chuang-Tzu, Mencius, several other Chinese geniuses all lived at the same time. It's like classical Greece in the time of Socrates and Sophocles and so forth. Then the political situation deteriorated very rapidly. The Zhou dynasty, which had been founded about 1100 BC, and the Book of Changes, its alternate title is the Book of Zhou. The Book of Changes is the brilliant emerging of the Zhou dynasty. And the Zhou were like the bright, new, promising people, 1100 BC. They were displacing the Shang dynasty. And the Shang dynasty is famous for its bronzes, for its ritual bronzes, for its bronze armor, for its bronze swords, so that ritual military might characterized the Shang, whereas the Zhou is characterized by jade. And so a more refined, elegant, deeper quality comes into Chinese civilization. Jade displaces bronze. Instead of ritual vessels, you have symbolic shapes. The 6 symbolic shapes of early Zhou jade include the completely circular P, and one that is a rectangle that has a slight diagonal cut across the top. And there are several others. I'll bring some slides one of these times and show you these shapes. So the 6 shapes of jade in the Zhou are like another form of the hexagram structure, which the Book of Changes as being the esoteric philosophy of the Zhou, had this sense that there was a 6-fold quality to the gestalts of the real. Lao Tzu coming after the Zhou dynasty had flourished for 500 years and began to decline, within a couple of generations of the beginning of its decline, Lao Tzu appears, and the Tao Te Ching is sort of the tail end of this brilliant civilization started by the I Ching. It's as if one takes a look at Western civilization and we say to ourselves that 500 years ago there was a great Renaissance, and that 1492, 500 years before 1992, you have the age of Columbus, you have the Spanish driving out the last of the Muslims from Spain, returning of Spain to Christianity, so that the Americas that were explored by the Spanish are now Muslim but Christian. It makes a whole different sense of world history. Ficino in Florence is translating Plotinus for the first time. Lorenzo de' Medici dies in that year, and it ends the whole development of the Medici geniuses supporting Florence. So that 500 years ago is like the Renaissance beginnings of our civilization, which is now coming to a transition. There needs to be something new. And we can, in 1992, see that. Lao Tzu comes about 3 generations after that perception in ancient China, that the Zhou dynasty had lost its heavenly mandate. And though it continued through inertia to ostensibly control events, the period right after Lao Tzu was called the period of the warring states. And for several hundred years, it was the largest warlord armies that were victorious, and they really didn't care about philosophy, about mysticism, about art, and that it finally ended up with the toughest, largest warlord establishing a kingdom which included everybody. And from his name, the Chinese people take the name Chinese. Qin Shi Huang Ti, the man who built the Great Wall. And so the people who live in that part of the world ever since have called themselves by his family name, Chinese. That was about 220 BC. So from the time of Lao Tzu to the time of the building of the Great Wall of China, a period of about 300 years, it was a period of constant decline with some plateaus. The first plateau was immediately after Lao Tzu, and that was the plateau when Confucius lived. And Confucius, in his sense of how to preserve life, of how to keep the quality and integrity of life, said we must remember the best of the past and put it into some kind of educational curriculum so that the best of the past can serve the present. And this is the Confucian outlook. And that particular quality expressed itself in aphorisms. So that the whole notion of when you go to eat, even today, in a Chinese restaurant, they give you a fortune cookie. The origin of the aphorisms of the fortune cookie is the form of wisdom of Confucius, the master said. Master Kung. In Chinese it's Confucius, and the Latin phonetic speaking of Confucius is Confucius. So Master Kung says. And so this kind of aphorism knowledge, where you would quote an aphorism. But it wasn't so much that Master Kung, that Confucius made up these wise sayings, it's that he excerpted them from the past. And so Confucianism is all based upon looking back for wisdom, looking back for the pithy, wise sayings, which you can take as rules of thumb to improve your present. And so the Warring States period is characterized by an increasingly Confucian outlook on life. So that when Qin Huang Ti conquered everybody, killed all the competition, built the wall to keep out everybody that he didn't care to own, he chose the Confucian way of educating to build a dynasty that would last forever. But he made the mistake, as usual tyrants make, he thought that he would live forever. And of course, as soon as he died, a new power group came in together, and they said, we're going to take his model of control, his power model, and we're going to make it work for us. And so the Han Dynasty was set up immediately following the death of Qin Shi Huangdi. They continued to extend the Great Wall. They continued to use Confucian outlooks on education, and they built a dynasty that lasted about 400 years. And the Han Chinese are the Roman Chinese. And in that sense, during the Warring State periods and during the Han Dynasty and the Qin Dynasty in between that lasted the lifetime of just one man, in all that time, very few people read Lao Tzu. And almost nobody understood, because Lao Tzu is vastly beyond the Confucian mold. The Confucian mind has a certain definite shape. It has a technique, it has a knack, it has an outlook which can be mastered perfectly. It's a role which one learns to play. And so the Han Chinese are the first ones to show that if everybody plays their role in the same script, we will have an abundant life. Of course, they forgot to mention that 98% of the people are not included in the script. They are the peasants, and they better provide us with food and fodder and other things, because we have heaven's mandate, and we now have a Confucian mold which will hold the dynasty together. And Lao Tzu is completely alien to that whole mindset. He's completely other to that series of expectations. The Tao Te Ching is based upon you as an existentially scintillatingly free individual, being able to amplify yourself into the cosmos. And that in doing so, you literally blow away all of the intermediate shell context within which somebody could paste labels on you, could nail or screw handles on you, could give you roles, and you outgrow all of these designated possibilities. And so the Taoist was an anomaly in Chinese life from the time of the first appearance of the Tao Te Ching until the fall of the Han Dynasty, which happened in the early 200s AD, early 3rd century. So if Lao-Tzu died around 500, it was about 750 years before there was any kind of introduction of this outlook, the Taoist outlook, to the common people. And yet, when it was introduced to the common people, for there were many radical reformers after the Han Dynasty fell, it shocked many talented people. A dynasty which had been around for 400 years suddenly was gone. I was, just to give you an example, I was in Western Canada when the Social Credit Party in Western Canada was voted out of office. It had been in office for almost 40 years. And it was an utter shock to people that this form of government was something that could go. And that a new form of government, at that time was the Progressive Conservatives, which was not a paradox in Canada. The Progressive Conservatives came in, won the election, and took over the government. And they were dazed for weeks because they didn't know how to assume power. Because the social credit power had been in power for 2 generations and people had kind of forgotten that this power group can go. So you can imagine that in the China, after the fall of the Han that had been around for 400 years, there was a period of several generations where nobody could get it together. In that period, Tao, the Tao, came into its own. And there were, all of a sudden, dozens or scores or perhaps hundreds of talented people who no longer had a recognizable role, who drifted off into the countryside probably just to get something to eat, probably to get some shelter. Who knows what mundane reasons had started them, but eventually whole little groups of Tao influenced communities sprung up all across the Chinese landscape, like esoteric groups in an Appalachian American setting. All of a sudden, back in the backwoods and the hinterlands were all these utopian Taoist communities. Everywhere, out of control, nobody controlled them. And out of that milieu, out of that landscape of people's Taoism, rose forms of government which were based upon free individual. Forms of investigation that are very much the foundation of Chinese science. Forms of religious participation which taught children from birth that transcendence is a normal part of the human apparatus and expectation. So that by several generations of this, by the time of the 300s in China, around 300 in China, you began to have enormous populations of people who were very much like we are today, psychologically very open to change, personally very open to geographically moving, religiously very open to being tolerant of lots of different perspectives. And out of this rose a form of the Tao which was religious, because there were a lot of people who lived by this. Hundreds of thousands, actually. And out of this whole era of, say, between 250 AD and 400 AD, rose religious Taoism. And because it was a folk-based movement, it had all the tones that folk-based movements have. It had handicrafts, it had folk tales, it had the kind of herbal medicine that you would get out in the hinterland. It had a lot of magic and pizzazz to it. And so religious Taoism that rises between 250 and about, say, 450 AD, in those 2 centuries, religious Taoism is the beginnings of whole lineages of Taoism that come down to the present day. For instance, Master Ni here in Los Angeles is 76th generation. He has a scroll, which he unrolled for me one time, and it has the names of all the generations going back to the beginning. And the beginning is all in this period of religious Taoism. So that the Taoist lineages, the cult religious lineages, Master Ni's lineages, generally known as the Mao Shan Taoist. Shan means mountain. Mao in this case is not hair, like Mao Zedong refers to hair, that character in Mao's name. But Mao Shan is a mountain, quite a large mountain, somewhat south of present-day Nanjing. So here's a map of China. Up here is Beijing. Down here on the coast is Shanghai. Way down here is Canton. Nanjing is up by Shanghai, but inland a little bit and a little bit north. And just south of Nanjing is a mountain very, very famous in Taoist history. And the Mao Shan Taoist, my own mentor, Guy Shu, was from that same lineage. Before this period of religious Taoism, the Tao was an ineffable consciousness that appeared in very rare individuals, almost nobody. So that the Taoist, before Taoism, was a rarity, a rare gem, a rare jewel. So there were almost no commentaries on Lao Tzu, on the Tao Te Ching, in all that period of time. So that one of the first commentaries, written about 245 AD by Wang Pi, is usually considered one of the first of the commentaries, if not the first. Wang, W-A-N-G-P-I. Wang Pi only lived to be about 30 years old, 29 and 30. And so he died very young, but his commentary has come down. It still exists. It's translated into English, and I brought a copy. There are very few references in written literature in Chinese to the Tao Te Ching or to Lao Tzu before this. In the Han Dynasty, one of the great emperors, Han Wu-Ti, about 140 AD, decided that there should be histories of all the great persons and employed a father and son. The son is the great historian Sima Qian. And there's a biography in Sima Qian of Lao Tzu. And it doesn't contain much information. It just says that that his family name was Li, and he was called in his lifetime Li Er, which means the ears, big ear. He was an archivist for the rulers, which means that he was in the palace of the Zhou, and that he, as a keeper of records, he was very wise, and he lived a long time. And when he was 200 years old, he retired, he left, he went out to the West. And in China, always the West is the promised land. Just like an American manifest destiny. Head toward the sunset in the West. And just as he went over the Hankou Pass, which in the China of his time was not the great pass that we would think of at the Sunmen Gorge, but another pass, a smaller pass, near Loyang, actually. That the keeper of the gate, Yin Shi, asked him to leave some evidence of wisdom. And Lao Tzu, on the back of a water buffalo, wrote down 5,000 characters swiftly with no punctuation, and that was the original Tao Te Ching. And then rode off to the west and gone. Now that legend, and it is a legend, that legend in Sima Chen appealed so much to Han Wu Ti about 140 BC that he sent expeditions as far west as his power could reach, which was all the way to contemporary Persia. And he had envoys bring back a person of whom the Chinese chronicles call the mystical mother of the West, a woman. And that this mystical mother of the West was brought to the court of Han Wu Ti, and that in Chang'an, and there was this audience, the meeting of the man emperor and the divine woman, and they talked about the Tao. They talked about how rare it was, and the Queen Mother of the West, the mystical Queen Mother of the West, as the Chinese legend goes, told Han Wu Ti that she had a peach seed for him to plant in his garden, and that when this seed grew this peach tree, and the peach tree matured to have other peaches, he would then have lived a space which would have prepared him to hear the Tao. And he asked her how long that would take, and she said that these peach trees fruit every 3,000 years. Now, Han Wu Ti is a good Han emperor, couldn't wait 3,000 years to mature himself, so he wanted a shortcut. So he got busy and bent the arms of certain Taoists that had been brought to court. They're called in Chinese Feng Shi, or Feng Qi. They're court magicians, sycophants. And he interested them by torture and by gold and other emperor means to make shortcuts for him. That the whole thing about being able to hear the Tao was to become a Shen, to become an immortal. Well, he wanted shortcuts to become immortal, and so what was born was the development of Chinese alchemy related to Taoism about making elixirs. And that if you took the right elixir, you would live forever. You would become an immortal, a Shen. Now, usually in Han Dynasty, court Taoist Chinese elixirs, they didn't use herbs, but they used metal derivatives, like gold, ostensibly. So they would put little flecks of gold in a drink. But they deepened this by seeing that gold was what was the ultimate outcome, and what you wanted to give to someone who would make the gold within themselves was the metal of transmutation, so that you would swallow the metal of transmutation, and then you would make the gold in yourself, and that would make you immortal. So instead of putting gold, little flecks of gold, the metal of transmutation was mercury. And so they put little bits of mercury. And of course you get mercury poisoning very, very quickly and die rather strange and mythical deaths. So Chinese alchemy was born in the Han Court time, emphasizing immortality by drinking metallic elixirs. You can see that in this kind of a little skit of Chinese history, almost nobody read Lao Tzu. Almost nobody understood. And the occasional rare spirit who did, like Chuang-Tzu, was as far out, if not further out, than Lao Tzu. The only translation that comes down to us of any commentary before Wang Pi is the one by Ho Shang Kong. And most Western scholars are busy trying to prove that he must have lived in the 500s AD, or at least in the 300s AD. But actually, Ho Shang Kong is a mystical genius who lived in the Warring States period, who lived about 2 generations after Chuang-Tzu. And his commentary on Lao Tzu is translated into English and published in Ascona, Switzerland, about 45 years ago. I have a copy here, first edition. Po in Chinese means river, and literally his name, Ho Shang Kong, means the old man who lives by the river. But the commentary that Ho Shang Kong has on the Tao Te Ching flows in the same way that the Tao Te Ching flows. So that it's not a commentary of a static prosaic nature kibitzing on something dynamic, but it is itself just as dynamic as the Tao Te Ching. And ancient Taoist phrase is that someone who has this kind of nature is wind-born, was never born static, but was born on the fly and rising. So that Ho Shang Kong's commentary on Lao Tzu, I'm going to bring back next time, is almost as difficult as Lao Tzu himself to read, to understand. And by the time you get to Wang Pi, 750 years after Lao Tzu, Wang Pi's commentary is usually characterized by academics, East and West, as metaphysical, because it's the beginning of this religious Taoism rather than the Tao. And when you make an ism of anything, it has at the same time a reductive and a kind of a smearing quality of extension. All of this is at most recent 1800 years ago. And in all that time, there have been every possible version of scrambling, of misunderstanding the Lao Tzu, of misunderstanding the Tao Te Ching. In our time, since the late 1970s, we have a very particular advantage, because copies of the Tao Te Ching were found in tombs in this little village in China, which predate Ho Shang Kong, before there were any commentaries whatsoever. They're just about a generation after Chuang-Tzu. So that we have a text now available to us. We're the first generation for 2,300 years that have a text that has not been tampered with, not been edited. And so the text of the Tao Te Ching, which we have now, is actually very surprising in one basic way. That the book is about Tao Te. Not Tao and Te, but Tao Te. About how Te displaces Tao naturally. That Tao you never see, but in this subtle, mysterious movement, Te emerges, and you know that Tao has allowed it to come through. So that the discussion, actually, 2,300 years ago, in the text that we have before the editors, the discussion of Te comes before Tao, because you cannot talk about Tao. But you can talk about Te. And so my translation is starting with the sections on Te. And I'm doing Te in such a way that the overall presentation of Te in all these weeks that we're taking to do the translation, do the preparing, will present Te not as power, not particularly as virtue, but will present Te as itself, will not use any translation at all, but present Te in such a way that it can be displaced by Tao. Now the only way that Te can be displaced by Tao, because Te doesn't return back to Tao, Tao allows for Te to come through. Now we talked about that 5-phase energy cycle. That in that 5 phases, the first phase cannot be given any designation, and so we can give it a non-designation of 0. That the Tao then is a 0 base progression. And that the first phase that can be numbered is Te. And so 1 is Te, unity, oneness. So that Te is not so much power or virtue, but it's the mysterious amperage that unity has. That whenever unity is operative, that's what Te is. And what happens is that Te does not cause, just like Tao does not cause Te, Te does not cause the 3rd phase. The 3rd phase is where we are. The first phase is 0 numbered, Tao. The 2nd phase is oneness, Te. The 3rd phase is where we are, which is 2. Our nature is in polarity, in distinction, in two-ness, in duality, but also underlying all of this two-ness is this innate capacity to bring the 2 into the primordial oneness. And because we can't take the 2 back to the primordial oneness, we balance the 2 as a unity. And in doing so, the bridge between the 2 becomes a relational, noticeable. It becomes a 3rd. So that the relation that resolves into complementation of polarity becomes for us the next phase. The 4th phase, given designation 3. So that what we make are 3s. We make trinities. We make trinities not because we need to, or want to, or hope to, but on an even deeper level, because that's what we do. When we are full at our best, we make 3s And so the 3 comes out of the 2 just like the 2 comes out of oneness, just like oneness comes out of the 0 base. With this stipulation, we have to stop ourselves from thinking of 1, 2, 3 in cardinal number sequence and recognize that they are an ordinal number progression. I spent all last Saturday talking to the Saturday group about how important that has been in world consciousness in the 20th century. And I don't want to go into it here. You can listen to that tape if you get interested in this. I'm just saying this, that the Taoists, before Taoism, always understood that Tao does not cause Te, just as Te does not cause us. And the Chinese term for us is human-heartedness, Zhen. And we do not cause the 3s. The 3s are usually on the level that we would call symbols. Mind, symbols. And they do not, in their term, the 4th phase does not cause the 5th phase, which is the world of the 10,000 things. In Chinese, the world, the 10,000 things are called Li, and that 4th phase, the symbols, is called Yi, and in Lao Tzu, he says of Yi that this is righteousness, and Li is propriety. Li is actually principle. So that there's a Chinese book of rites called the Li Qi. Yi means that the symbols in our mind are very fertile. And it's not that we have caused them to come into being, because it isn't the phase before the one that you're looking at that causes it. It's that the phase twice removed from it resonates with it and corresponds with it. This is a principle or an idea which I've given the name grandfather phasing or grandmother phasing. So that actually what is consonant with the symbols, with the E, is Te. So that the symbols have efficacy, they have virtue, they have power, they have, because they are resonant with Te. Now the Chinese character that is for symbols for this 4th level, Yi, like an I Ching, Book of Changes. It isn't so much I Ching is Book of Changes, is that I Ching is the book where the symbolic influence structures the world of 10,000 things because it's resonant with Te. But the symbols, they have fertility, they have reality because they're resonant with Te. Our human-heartedness is resonant with Tao. So that when human beings are real, they are Tao. Not as an identity, but as a virtual reality. And not only that, but the world is resonant with us. So that there are 3 correspondences in the 5-phase energy cycle that resonate together. The Tao, the Zhen, and the Li, the world. Or as a Chinese phrase would say, we are the bridge between heaven and earth. We are the bridge between Tao and Li. So that when a Taoist speaks of nature, he means cosmic primal nature of Tao, our eternal nature, and the nature of this world out here are all the same thing. Closer than identity, all the same thing. So that later on, when a Taoist wishes to express this consonance, he will make a landscape scroll painting of mountains and streams without end, of nature. And if he does it just right, he puts his gem in correspondence with that landscape painting, which is in correspondence with Tao. So that somebody 1,000 years later could unroll that scroll and sit with it in just the right way and tune their gem to that scroll. And in doing so, tune themselves consequently also with Tao. And you see that the Taoist, as distinct from Taoism, prizes art rather than magic. The Taoism prizes magic and elixirs for physical priming immortality. The Taoist prizes art as a consummate experiencing of the real, of not immortality, but of eternity. And you don't need any physical cribbing whatsoever. Because when the psyche becomes consonant with the Tao, it transforms into spirit. And instead of being a psychophysical animal, one becomes a spirit, a Shen, as the Chinese would say. Well, I will bring some more material back next week and give you 4 more chapters in translation. And I hope to be able to get to a Xerox machine. If I can get this typed up, I will bring the 16 chapters that I have. I have to get this typed up and then I'll run off copies for you. Now, I would appreciate if you just keep them to yourselves. And it seemed like it, but this is a little esoteric, and it's really not the right time to release all of this.